Introduce our next guest speaker. We have from the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations.
Well done. You can read
That's
well.
good that you put that up there. I know it's not Ministry of Environment anymore, but it's easier. We have Sue Pollard here to discuss Steelhead management in BC, and I'll let you kind of maybe give a bit of a background on it all.
On it all. Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sue.
So, Dan, at our last provincial angling advisory meeting, I guess he, shortly after that, when he was talking about getting together, and he just recently invited me to come and speak to you guys. And I'm going to just throw it out there and forgive the I hope we can have lots of interaction during this presentation, because I've been in Habitat Conservation Trust Fund proposal reviews all week, and I haven't had a real great opportunity to put something really polished together. So I'm hoping that we can have some dialogue all through the conversation, and if something's just, we'll just cruise through if it's not of interest. So I have been in this position. It's with headquarters over Victoria in the Fish and Wildlife Branch. I've been in for just over 2 years. It was a newly created position to hopefully try to coordinate. I'm called a rivers specialist, so coordinating all species, supporting riverine species in BC, so not just steelhead, but sturgeon, bull trout, cutthroat. So, as you can imagine, a significant portion of my time is spent on steelhead, and the Skean and the Thompson consume a lot of that. So that's what I've been doing. I've been working coordinating with our regional steelhead biologists in BC. We've had a number of meetings to try to develop a more coordinated approach to how we're going to continue to manage with fewer and fewer resources in BC. So I don't know, does anybody have any questions about that whole, my background? So when I came on 2 years ago, I was basically told the number one priority is to develop a management plan for steelhead in BC, and that's been a pretty daunting task. I know it's been a priority. You guys have made it a priority, and a number of other stakeholder groups made it a priority. And it's a real challenge to figure out what people really want or think when they talk about a management plan. What does that look like? So I spent a bit of time trying to sort that out and thinking about planning fundamentals. I worked with a couple of our research folks over at UBC, and I really like this idea of really what do you want in one of these plans. So one of the first things you want to do is know where you're at. Okay, so you want to establish the status of whatever it is you're interested in, the fishery, the fish. So what's going on? So you know the starting point. And then the second piece, okay, so we know where we're at. Where do we want to get to? Objectives or desired state. Thirdly, think about, well, what's stopping us from moving from the current state to the desired state? Identifying all those kinds of limiting factors. And finally, the key piece that you guys are probably most interested in is how we're going to get there, those actions. So trying to break out a plan like that, it helps me to think about things a little more in a more organized fashion. So what I was going to do is just sort of go through each of those pieces. And again, there may be a lot of information. You guys probably know more about steelhead than me. I come at it, my background is a conservation geneticist, and I spent a lot of years working on fish species at risk, working collaboratively, doing actually one of the big projects I have been involved in is steelhead stock ID up in the Skeena, using genetic tools to help figure out different runs of stocks. So I am familiar with the species, quite familiar, and I've been up there a number of times and I'm in love with that area of the world. But from a more of a fisheries perspective, you'd have me beat. So if I say something doesn't sound right, let me know. But I think there's a great opportunity, and I'm really excited to be here and to have an opportunity to talk to the people that I think, as we have fewer and fewer resources in government, I think we need to figure out how to work better with you guys. And I think that's mainly why I took this job, because I felt in government, we hardly have a voice anymore, and so we don't have the resources, but I think if we can find some common ground to work on things together, I think we have a much better chance of moving some of those pieces forward. So just looking at stock status in BC, this is, like I said, it's a bit of a recycled top from a couple of years ago, and I don't think it's changed all that much. There's some new things going on maybe, but I was just going to talk about the stocks themselves, and then talk about where we're at with the fishery and some highlights there, and then the management and how we're going to proceed from there. So stock status then. I think most of my pictures are from the Skenas. That's where I've had most of my opportunity to take pictures and gather pictures from. So stocks, you guys know what a stock is. It's basically our fundamental unit for management. We look at them basically as a fairly independent, self-reproducing unit, and they tend to be fairly reproductively isolated from other populations. So there are an incredible number of stocks in BC. I think based on sort of a standard way of looking, we came up with about 130 stocks. So this is winter and summer stocks across 7,000 kilometers of coastline. And when you think about that, for me, that's pretty daunting to think about trying to manage that many somewhat independent units. And so of course we can't, and as you know, we probably have information on a very small proportion of those. We try to pick the key populations that either reflect what's going on more regionally, or they are high priority fisheries stocks. So of course they aren't all created equal, as you are well aware. And there's a huge amount of diversity and variability in productivity and that's just natural productivity, natural abundance out there, even before we start thinking about the limiting factors associated with them all. And so environment does play a huge role in creating, in how these stocks adapt over time. And this stuff, I find it so interesting to look at that. The majority of stocks, believe it or not, well, you probably do. The stocks in BC are found in really small, fairly small coastal streams. Okay, so we're already dealing with a fairly low natural freshwater capacity. And in my way, I think that already we're starting with a fairly small population. That's pretty vulnerable, and that's before we start thinking about all the anthropogenic type human-induced effects on those populations. So this means that for most of our stocks, we're dealing with 500 or less adults, again, in their natural condition, and in most cases, or many cases, maybe 100 or less adults. So that kind of underscores that we're dealing with relatively small, even, we think of them as healthy, but they're small populations. And when you think of the US, that's pretty different. I think Bob Hooton estimated that we might have a total of about 500,000 steelhead in BC adults. And down there, I mean, they've got some rivers that historically produced 50,000 adults. So I hear people saying, why can't we have, the harvest fisheries like they do down in the States and things like that? We are dealing with a fairly different animal up here in terms of productivity and ability to withstand those kinds of impacts. So, and now I'm talking about the pristine condition in all of these cases. So again, that's not the case anymore down in the States, at least not for wild populations. So just talking about the natural condition. So this ecotype, I think this is a really important thing to think about as well. Ecotype means the diversity of stocks or types you get based on ecology and environment. And we have, I know there's lots of variability within these three, but Bob Hooton and others have basically over time identified three main ones that we have. Those are the coastal winters, okay, and then we've got the coastal summers and the interior summers. And these are really important to make sure we keep separate in our mind, thinking about various types of vulnerabilities. You can see there that most of our fish, as I mentioned, are in that coastal winter group, and they tend to be, I'm generalizing here because I know there's exceptions for all these categories, but they tend to be the fairly small and productive systems on the coast. And then the coastal summers, similarly, so many of them tend to be small and unproductive, but we do have some exceptions there. And then the interior summers, which got, you know, the Thompson, the upper Skeena. So again, these ecotypes are something we're interested in maintaining. They provide different opportunities for angling. They have different exposures to things like interception and habitat impact. So again, all stocks are not created equal, and I don't really think I need to keep emphasizing that. Anybody got any questions? Yeah?
When you use the term stock, are you using the term stock as in a race of fish, or as in a river with
It's
multiple
kind of,
races of fishes?
I guess when I say stock, I would say in some stocks, in some rivers, we have a summer and a winter run, so that's two different stocks. Is that what?
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking of the Gold River, and they would have a Muchelat race of fish, they'd have a Heber race of fish, they'd have a Upper Gold race of fish. That to me is three stocks.
Yeah, I mean,
Of
it's
just
kind
some
of
runs alone, right?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, people use that term in different ways, and you know, we could talk about a composite stock, which is what we're talking about there, is a compilation of sort of local stocks or local populations, and I think I use the term kind of loosely, and we could, you know, it is a management term.
Yeah.
So.
So are you using stock as a specific genotype?
They tend to be, but even within those stocks, you might find some variation as well on some of these bigger ones, like the earlier running portion of, say, a bigger stock in the Maurice, the bulky, versus a later running stock. They're going to be, you know, they go to different spawning locations, and they will tend to be slightly genetically differentiated. But it is pretty hierarchical, and so there's not really rather than specific classes, it's quite a gradation there, right? So I mean, it's like talking about species. I mean, at what point does something become a species versus, you know, just a unit within? So I guess we use it fairly loosely. We talk about the Thompson stock, but then within the Thompson, there's a number of local stocks or populations that we would consider independently, right? So, yeah, it's a bit of a loose terminology, I suppose.
You also said you're a geneticist, so what is your understanding of the race of Steelhead and its very close cousins, the rainbows? I'm not trying to get into a different topic here. But,
that's a really interesting one.
Yeah, so what is your experience with that?
I mean, it's just increasingly, the more we look, the less we really understand it. What looks like being revealed is that rainbow and Steelhead are actually one big
Complicated mess.
And that those two phenotypes, it really is driven depending on what a better life history strategy is. Is it better to go to sea and get big, or is it better to stay resident and avoid that sort of lower ocean survival?
But in your opinion, would you say that they're essentially, like if I have rainbows and Steelhead in the Better River, or the Upper Better River, and they spawn together, would you say that was one stock, one race of fish, and just some of them go to the ocean as a survival strategy?
I used to not, but now with some of the results that are coming out, they're finding that Steelhead are giving, well, we always knew that Steelhead could produce residents, but
Yep.
now we're finding also with the genetic marking that's going on, it's really cool. They're finding that resident females and males are producing anadromous sea-run fish. So it's more complicated. We just can't slot them into these categories, and I think it's somewhat dependent on the system. You know, you might have an upstream resident population of rainbow trout, and further downstream you've got your and they don't mix as much. But in other systems, there could be a lot more mixing, plus the fact that they are able to, under different environmental conditions, which is probably why they are resilient. They have managed to survive in some cases because of that flexibility in life history. I find it really interesting. I don't know how far we can push them. You know, they can only push them so far before, yeah.
I just know they consider Steelhead the least evolved of all the salmonids.
Yep.
Compared to finks or chums, which seem to have because they're more bigger numbers. But when you look at this, it actually makes you think of steelhead and rainbows is probably.
I think that they are the most complicated because of their complicated life history. I mean, it's, you know, we can generalize for a particular system. These guys are they're going to generally spend 1 to 2 years in freshwater, whatever it is, right? But there is some flexibility in there. Whereas with a pink, you get it. This is what they do, boom, 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 and there's not a lot of variation there. And so I think that even though they're, you know, these are much less naturally abundant, this is the life history strategy they've chosen to, you know, have that diversity there. Anybody else? So, this is probably pretty obvious, that if you're steelhead, basically where you come from is really going to affect anywhere accessibility, interception issues, marine survival, vulnerability to low flows in fresh water, and therefore the interest from both the sport and First Nation aspect in terms of use and conservation status. That's pretty obvious stuff. So based on relative population abundance, and there were 3 main zones there: routine management zone, which is really where we want our populations to be, conservation zone, which, you know, we start to get concerned if we see numbers like that, and extreme conservation concern zone, which we're really quite worried now if we see these populations in this area for a prolonged period of time. You know, we start to worry that these things are heading nowhere good. So, you know, ideally, we do this for all our stocks. In reality, I think we've got, you know, maybe a handful of stocks that we can really do this quantitatively for, but, you know, with the biologists in various regions, they do tend to get an idea of when they're, you know, at what point they look at habitat carrying capacity, at what point they think their populations are more or less in that routine zone. But regardless, I really like this concept. It's easy to understand, and you know, and for you guys and for us to have a common language around. So basically, you know, the closer you get to that extreme conservation concern area, the more you're going to focus any activities on conservation rather than on use, and vice versa. When you get into that routine management zone, you can start thinking about how you can provide a diversity of opportunities. So this is pretty old now. I just realized it is 10 years ago. We haven't had a really thorough analysis of stock status in BC since that time. This is based a lot on the steelhead harvest analysis data that you guys provide through those questionnaires, which I highly encourage you to return. But I think the general picture, more or less, you know, there's a message here, and I think it more or less stands. The further north you go, the better things tend to be. Obviously, there's some exceptions both up there and both down here. We do have some fairly robust and thriving populations down here, which didn't get captured at this time on this map. Most recently, we have started to see some upturn in the south coast streams, particularly on Vancouver Island and some of the lower mainland streams, which you're probably aware of. And of course, we've got our very low but seemingly stable populations like the Thompson, like the Keogh. They're kind of bumping along at a very low level now. And then there are some which continue to go along in that routine management zone. And all the other things being equal, and they aren't necessarily, people are more and more pointing to this issue of marine survival, which appears in many cases to be a dominating factor that explains, at least in a regional perspective, trends in abundance. It's quite outstanding in some cases. And it's frustrating because marine survival, it's a bit of a black hole for us and for you guys. You know, when we say, oh, the population status right now is being driven by marine survival, there's not a lot we can do. We're losing them all. There's a ton of crazy acronyms and concepts out there, and making sense of this stuff is a bit of a challenge. I'm pretty excited, actually. I'm going down to Skamania in mid-March to a Steelhead meeting with all the states, the U.S. states, and managed to organize a session there on climate change and its effects on steelhead. So I got some great mostly Americans. I'm trying to engage a couple of our BC folks at SFU and the KEO to get engaged in this issue and try to better understand marine survival and how we can sort of, take any actions to assist in at least doing the best we can in areas we can to deal with this issue.
Hey Sue,
Yeah.
so the last two falls, like last fall and just
Yeah.
this fall finished, interior coho are just booming.
Yeah.
For the first time, last 2 years, first time in like 15
Yeah.
years, right?
Yeah.
So did you see any big jumps in
Yeah, I think my
Thompson coho, like, or Thompson steelhead?
Jumps in Thompson Steelhead, not jumps, I think Rob was talking about a slight increase, and same with the Chilcotin. Yeah, I wouldn't say major jumps though.
Because I always assumed that steelhead, based on the coho
Yeah,
zero kill policy
Yeah.
and marine survival coming back, that they would kind of follow each other in
Yeah.
a trend, but
Yeah.
that doesn't seem to be happening, or it's not happening as
Right.
obvious right away. It may
Right.
happen down the road, but
yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I mean, there is some expectation that, we should start to see a little bit of an improvement around some of the south coast, given what's going on in the ocean. And like I said, we have started to see that on the coastal systems. And I wouldn't say we've seen a decline. In fact, I think this year we had an estimate that was a little bit better than last year.
Not so good this year to start off with.
What's that?
Not so good this year.
Oh, I thought it was higher than last year, I thought.
For steelhead, starting
Yeah.
for this winter run season, not so
Oh.
good. I mean, there's fish around, but
Yeah,
it's
okay.
not seemingly
Okay.
stellar anywhere.
If the last 2 years we saw an upswing of, a little bit of an upswing
Yeah.
in South Coast, how does that explain a major downturn in the North Coast, basically the Skeena system? I mean, DFO was running around the end of September, beginning of October,
Yeah.
saying the run was 55% or 50 to 55% of the 20-year average. Their way of saying it's the worst year they've seen in 25 years.
For
Steelhead,
Steelhead in Skeena.
yes.
I know they did have a lower year this year. They did, compared to last year. And the dean was, because the dean had some other specific issues. But the Skeena did definitely, it wasn't, I don't know if I'd say it was the worst year. It was not a great year. Seems to be some periodicity on odd and even year. It's interesting when you look at the long-term time series for the Skeena, it does sort of bounce around from odd to even year. And the odd
Yeah,
years,
also
I don't know how likely that is, but,
Also depends on how many nets are in the bottom end of the
well,
Skeena,
yeah,
which is,
yeah, no, that's,
I mean, that screws your numbers up right there.
I know,
Hard to do science when,
don't get me started.
all right, enough said on that.
And I mean, reality too is they are a cyclical creature. You're gonna have highs and lows. I mean, we had a bunch of really good
Yeah.
years. It can't be the best
Yeah.
year ever, forever, and ever, and ever.
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Well, yeah, they are variable. Oh,
Yeah, there's another black hole that I don't think we've ever even considered before, and you touched on it briefly before when we talked about the role of resident rainbows.
it is, I know Rob
and-
Bison's been doing some work on that.
Yes, but what I'm getting at is it's likely that not only does, and I go back to like the 70s when the Fish and Wildlife Branch had biostandard where,
Yeah.
wild steelhead marine survival was 12%, and that was
Yeah.
it. And we had these other biostandards
Yeah.
for 0 plus to 1 plus and 1,
Yeah.
all these survival rates sort of built in that we thought were, standard. But what I'm saying is it's likely that the rate of anadromy varies a lot.
The which, the,
Rate of anadromy,
Yeah.
in other words, the rate that
yep.
a young micas will, how many of them will actually go to the ocean and how many will
Well,
stay.
now that that's starting to open up, I think that's an area that really requires a lot of,
Yeah.
because we never really thought about that. We just assumed that steelhead were steelhead and rainbows were rainbows for the most part. And
No, it
that's-
changes everything.
And so it really is changing a lot. And then, I'd like to think that we're not so focused on, oh, the rainbows are out competing the steelhead, because I don't think that's the case either. You know, I think these things are just adjusting to what's going on in the environment, and you hope to goodness that if we, you know, we see a fairly, you know, complete or almost complete loss of anatomy in some of these systems, that they still retain that ability to migrate should the conditions provide a more friendly environmental condition for them. Yeah.
This may be a simplistic question, but how do you explain, if you're saying that marine survival is the biggest factor, and yet you look at your drawing, your diagram of the province, and all of your extreme steelhead that are in extreme trouble are all concentrated in the lower west part of the province, where the highest urban area of the province is.
No, I agree. I mean, that, and I know that this is something we do need to resolve, because I mean, I'm saying that has been, I mean, it seems to be the line that I hear most frequently, that marine survival is the biggest driving, or biggest limiting factor in general for steelhead right now. But you're right.
I think those are contradictory.
No, well, maybe. Now, there is a big study going on right now in the Salish Sea. I mean, there's some thought that the Salish Sea, which is down in, you know, yeah, Georgia Strait, there's some concern that fish just aren't getting out of there. So that's marine. For some reason now, it's also very urbanized in that whole general vicinity. But there are some studies right now going on to look at that particular area where a lot of those fish come down, right? Like the Thompson, and a lot of the coastal systems come into that area before they head out. And so there's some, they feel that there's something specific to that region that.
Like fish farms.
Ding, 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 ding. Well, they're good, we'll expand them. Let's make more.
It seems it's not in the north.
But they've also shown that the stocks that are doing well in our lower mainland area are all stocks that mostly go straight out of Wanapewka.
Yeah,
It seems to be the fish that all go through the Johnson Strait that are all in trouble.
Yeah. Well, my husband is John Volpe, so he's been doing a lot of work with Alex and up there, and he, yeah, I mean, he totally agreed. But I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of confounding factors. I think there's a lot we just don't know.
All that being said too, I mean, Georgia Strait, like Coho's returned this year,
Yeah.
like the bluebacks around,
Yeah.
there is some positive
Yeah.
things seemingly happening, and
Yeah.
that haven't happened for a number of years too, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, when we see these generalizations, we have to remember they are generalizations, and there are lots of exceptions around. And people are looking for patterns to try and understand what in general is going on. I don't know if you guys want me to get into, where was I going? This stuff at all. Maybe it is kind of interesting to see the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So this is about this sort of regime shift in the ocean. Are you guys up to speed on that stuff? And, you know, it seems to be that this decadal shift seems to be a strong correlation between hot, so in the red, on the top graph there you'll see the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is really strongly tied to surface sea temperature. So the warmer years are in red and the cooler years are in blue. And so this study come out in the 1990s with some Chinook and Coho work down in Oregon. And you can see there's some real strong ties between that oscillation, that shift, regime shift in the ocean temperatures, and Chinook and Coho, Chinook more so maybe, but a Coho too, a response there. And so it's definitely something, you know, at a regional level again, something going on there.
Like, you have to remember, probably from the dip in that graph at 78 to right to the late 90s, there's an 80% harvest rate on Coho, right?
Ah. So that's,
And then
that's
that, you
not,
combine that with the
Yeah.
warm water,
yeah.
and then
both.
now people say, oh, it's marine survival, well,
Yeah.
they were decimated.
80%, that's like more than half of them.
Apparently it was okay.
It's only 11%.
Apparently it was okay. So,
Okay, so, I mean, this has been something that in the past has been somewhat predictable in terms of length, but it seems to be getting a little less predictable, and it seems to be affecting prey availability, competition, and there is some increasing evidence that possibly there is competition at sea. It's not just a big sort of bottomless resource system, and yep.
So, at any point at all, has there been, with all the competition and stuff like that, like, we're protecting a big part of the predation problem, the birds, the seals, these kinds of things. We have a higher population
Yeah.
of seals now than
Yeah.
ever
Yeah,
to eat fish.
yeah.
And we've done this correlation study.
Probably not at a regional
It's
scale.
way out of whack.
Yeah.
Seymour River, the
Right.
studies of,
Right.
basically bridge to bridge, and you go
Yeah.
through there and say, oh, look at all the birds, everywhere. Everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, I can make one comment, just looking at the graph
Yeah.
there. You look around the early to mid-80s, warm, and yet the best steelhead fishing we ever had around here was
Yeah,
around
that's a
1985.
good point. We did have that's a really good point. We had a fairly significant enhancement project, time then, and we had some of the best reported marine survivals for steelhead, at least from the Keel River, and we're assuming that was applicable elsewhere, relatively. No, yeah, so that early, yeah. I know, so this is just, again, this is a regional, it's sort of a generalization thing, how applicable it is. So Randall Peterman, a few years ago, he claimed that the North Pacific was becoming overcrowded with salmon, and I mean, that, I know it's hard to believe when you see some of the declines, but he basically said that there's twice as many salmon out in the Pacific compared to 50 years ago, and basically it's coming from these massive enhancement programs over mostly in Asia and also up in the Alaska. So there are a lot of fish out there, but just not the fish that we're necessarily interested in seeing return to our rivers. So again, correlation, how relevant is this? And in terms of that competitive issue, I don't know, but it's just another thing people put out there.
Interesting that we're having low winter run returns in the heels of a monster king salmon return getting that.
Yeah, although there is a prediction that we'll see a real positive response in the Keel because of the massive pink run we saw there. It'll be interesting to see if that does, because of the fertilization.
Yeah.
But that's,
So, and what you see is, some fish seem to be responding better to the system than others. So not all the species respond in the same way to these shifts in the ocean. Anyway, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I probably spent too much time there anyway, with some basic conclusions about marine survival. I think the key is these regime shifts may be somewhat less predictable, and it's with EFO, it's interesting, we've been challenged by them very recently that they are looking for more flexibility in season management because of this issue. Things are becoming less predictable, so they don't know when necessarily they're going to get a big, massive number of fish back, and so they're looking to us with some of the IFMP planning to allow them to have more flexibility in their in-season planning, which we're not really sure yet how to respond to that one, because we just think it means more interception. So just looking across, this was based on that Steelhead meeting, the coastwide meeting I went to 2 years ago, and it was generally south of the border, things are not great, as you can see.
Is that based on wild fish or wild hatchery?
These are wild. I mean, the hatchery-wise, they got phenomenal. And I hear that a lot, and people will ask, why can't we have hatchery programs like they do down there? The focus for the wild populations, at least, is most definitely on recovery, okay? Again, they are seeing some small increases here and there in spots, and similar issues to us in terms of what's limiting. Just in many cases, it's much more significant. In Alaska, last time anyway, I don't know if that's still the case, but things seem pretty good up there. How's everybody doing? My time. So this information, it's not quite up to date now, but this is a compilation of all the Steelhead questionnaire data that you guys provide, and I want to emphasize it's great to get that information back. I just had to take it over. What you see here, we've got two different scales. So the red is the provincial, so it's the provincial trend, and it's on the right hand, or sorry, the left hand scale there, and then the different colored lines are for the different steelhead management regions, and the scale is on the right there. So what you can see, I don't know if you guys have had a chance to look at this data before, but clearly there's been a decline in terms of what we're measuring here is angling effort, days fished over time, and that's not surprising. That's a pretty universal trend.
So if you could plot and say how many cards are coming back for a 10-year period, the amount of cards coming back is same, increasing, or decreasing?
In terms of proportion?
The amount of people sending the stuff back.
The proportion hasn't changed. So we get generally, we try, what we do is we try to send out questionnaires to 60 to 70% of all resident anglers, and then 100% to non-resident anglers. And generally we get a 30% response rate. So, in terms of numbers they may have decreased a little over time because of that, but the response rate, except when we do things that people really don't like, is generally around 30+%.
Is the actual number going down?
Yes.
The reason I say that is because I know of people who worked in fly shops that actually don't buy their license but fish steelhead.
Yes.
They only buy it if they're going to the Thompson. And they're not the only ones. There's lots of people on the river that don't have tags either.
So they're just not buying tags.
And that's because, how often are you going to get checked?
Yeah. Well, compliance is a
So, I mean, the numbers are
massive
going,
issue.
the numbers are going down, but the
So,
numbers on the river,
yeah, I mean, what,
the numbers on the river actually don't
significant-
say that. They say
Yeah.
they're actually going up.
really?
Yes.
You feel like the numbers on the
I live on the Vetter. I look
Yeah.
at the Vetter and I've been looking at it
Well,
for
the
20 years.
Steelhead
It's
better, it's consistently the biggest. It represents about 40% of all angling for steelhead in BC.
But it's the same thing when you go north. It's
Yeah.
getting busier up there too. So there's more people there.
And you can see that that's actually reflected here.
Yeah.
We are, back in the good old days, well, the Vetter's always driven that provincial trend, but back in the good old days, the Cowichan and Vancouver Island also contributed a fairly significant amount. But now you can see that it's really kind of bottomed out there. It doesn't contribute all that much. Well, I mean, it does still, more so than the Thompson and the mid-coast, but
But 2 years ago, they had one of the best years they've had in 25 years.
where's that?
In Cowichan.
Yeah, but that doesn't, I mean, people have to respond to that.
A lot of people didn't fish it, but the people that I know that
Yeah.
fished it had
So this
huge numbers.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously effort will track abundance to some extent. So but what we do see is that definitely, as you mentioned, increasing proportion are fishing the Skeena. And if you look at the top 5 streams, this is a little bit dated now, but I don't think it's changed all that much. The Chilliwack, well, it's off the scale here, as is the Bulkley, but again, that really is the most significant steelhead system in BC in terms of number of angler days it supports based on our
I've seen
steelhead.
angler days in a river that's closed to angling for steelhead.
Where's that?
Bellicose.
Oh, that is, that's a good question. Well,
It's really low.
yeah. No, I actually, I think maybe there's only 5 in there. There may not be that many of them, even that maybe why it's on there. Yeah, that's a good point though.
Rob,
I sold a saltwater license to a guy one time, and I asked him if he needed a salmon tank. He said no. He left his old license there. I looked on the back, and he's got a Chinooker carded in there. So it's like, well, he kind of half wanted to do the right thing.
If you ever said you were fishing in Bellacoola for steelhead to anybody that did that, you could charge them because it's closed to angling for steelhead.
We do get some interesting reports, I have to say.
Sue? I'm really surprised that the 5 Lower Mainland there, the Checamus is not one of them. So I see the Capilano is, I guess I turned my card in that way.
Well, yeah, in some cases, especially the smaller streams, I mean, you really, it's the bigger ones that you really, the message is stronger. There's a lot of noise around some of the smaller systems here. And yeah, how reliable this is again for the bigger systems like the Gulf and Chilliwack. Questionable when you're, when you only get 5 or 6 cars back for a particular system, how much weight can you put on that, right? So. All right, any other questions here?
That's based on steelhead only?
Yes. All right, so I'm going to talk about what we do in terms of management for steelhead in BC currently or in the past, so that you know the regions better than me. So I kind of clustered them like that, just because that's generally how we think about them. I think I do. So looking at the types of management we do, and I'm sorry if I've got something wrong there. This was done fairly quickly. So what I've got on here is quite a bit of information where we've got catch and release only, hatchery systems where bait's still permitted. CW stands for coastal winters. What else do I have here that may not make sense? And then I've identified where we actually are able to do stock or are doing stock assessment currently. So you can see the interior Fraser where Rob Bison's doing all this work. We've got pretty good assessment there. Whereas up in the Stikine, the Tiku, there's absolutely no assessment going on there. The Skeena, the Nass, there's some assessment, but it is challenging out there to get really good data. And Vancouver Island, pretty varied. I mean, we've got some that are pretty well assessed, others that we don't have any assessment on. So we've got some hatchery systems on Vancouver Island in the Lower Mainland, and then one up in the Skeena region, the Kitimat. So I think there's somewhere between 12, maybe 12 programs now remaining. So that's an overview. I don't know if anybody has any questions about that. I think the Thompson, I've got a closed till open. You know that that's now up for discussion. We're looking at shifting the management regime there. I think it's on the website or has been. So that, at first cut, that looks pretty diverse, variable, not a lot of consistency necessarily, but there are, again, issues that to some extent affect the way we do manage these systems. So we've got, the level of productivity associated with these different stocks. Again, CW is East Coastal Winter and IS is Inland Summer. So we got that to deal with. We've got a bunch of different types of limiting factors or issues that we're trying to deal with, which vary according to the system. Interception is an issue throughout all the systems, but to a varying degree, mostly summer run fish. Freshwater flows are particularly an issue for the interior, of course, and some of those regulated systems on the coast. And yeah, so I just try to, I'm trying to figure out how to put this together in a transparent way for me to explain our management regimes, so that, yeah, there's a lot of variation out there, but there's also a lot of variation in a number of things that we have to deal with. Yeah.
In this slide, what does interception refer to?
Oh, that would be commercial salmon interception.
Yeah, fishery, other fisheries.
Yes.
Interception
Mostly
from other
focusing
fisheries,
on the salmon, commercial.
So Sue, do you have any idea of what the interception rate would be, say for Thompson Steelhead or?
Well,
interior
you know,
filters?
Rob's calculated it right and claims it's, you know, he actually has an estimate. It's somewhere right now, I think it's somewhere around 10 to 20% sits in there, which is a lot lower. I'm trying to think now if it's a lot lower than it used to be, that's for sure. But I don't know how much that accounts for the Johnson Strait portion, or if it's just sort of the lower Fraser.
There's far fewer seine openings than there used to be, and those area chum fisheries were pushed from the mid part of October to the end of October, which saved a lot of fish.
Yeah, that's right. So that was it Barclay Sound? Was it? They have made some major shifts over time. Oh, and then of course the size of the rivers also influences and flows also may influence some management decisions. So this was just looking at access, again, and CW means classified waters, so we have a number of areas that do support classified waters for that wilderness or semi-wilderness quality angling experience. So again, quite a range of different types of fisheries and out there. Okay, so yeah, I mean, it does look like a bit of a patchwork in terms of how we manage, and the challenge for us is to come up with a sort of a science informed way that, you know, is transparent to you guys, makes sense, but also addresses that incredible diversity of issues that we're trying to address across the landscape for this broad range of species. So, you know, if you guys have any ideas on how we can help to improve that transparency or communicate these sorts of things to you, it'd be great to chat more. So, looking at our management objective, everybody hanging in there? I know it's lunchtime now. I recently, how many of you have seen this thing that I have developed and was presented at the last PAT meeting, our Provincial Angling Advisory meeting? Dan, did you send that to your group, or?
It's been through the directors.
Okay.
We thought it was top secret.
And we didn't send it out. We just passed it around because it was a draft.
Yeah.
And so we're very respectful of the process. So,
well,
as directors, though, we've all seen it and we've talked a lot about it.
And the reason I haven't more broadly distributed it because I thought that it would be the next round when we start putting some meat on the bones where people will really want to have input, and they've already done that. Then I thought I don't want to exhaust people with seeing this thing. That was just sort of a bare bones skeleton of where we were going to go with this, and so I'm hoping everybody can buy into that overarching. I mean, it basically focuses on our, you know, conservation of wild stocks being our top priority, but also ensuring that we maintain those societal benefits. So that's not only socioeconomic, but cultural and environmental benefits now, and not just for now, but for the future. So, you know, two major objectives here are, again, conservation and providing and maintaining diversity of opportunities for folks. And it all comes down to abundance of those wild fish. So, I know you guys know this stuff. Stock assessment, so what are some of our limiting factors? Stock assessment is a fairly significant one. That's actually a fish wheel up in one of the Skeena systems after a major high water event. Those little sticks are big trees. And so that, you know, that is a big challenge. Even if we had all the money in the world, it's really hard to assess some of these systems that are remote, that suffer from really high flows on a regular basis. It's a challenge in the Skeena, and that's why we only have where we have a couple of, you know, smaller systems like the Upper Sustet, we've got a weir there to count fish, but, you know, you can't do that everywhere. So, not to mention the resources, it's a real challenge. And coming up with defensible numbers, particularly when we're talking to DFO, because their fish spawn in the fall and ours spawn when it's really hard to get out there and count fish. It's a challenge, and I'm not sure we should continue to try to really push on that piece with them in particular. I mean, what do we call it? It's the the data death spiral. We could spin around with DFO forever as they ask us for better and better information, but we're not moving forward on what the real issue is. So that one continues to be a challenge for us. As I mentioned, climate change in the freshwater and marine environment, freshwater habitats, as you guys clearly presented earlier on, and then of course the interception, mostly with salmon fisheries, but also with other sport fisheries and First Nation fisheries. So those are some of the big issues we continue to figure out how to deal with, and trying to weigh them and figure out what the most significant limiting factors are for different stocks is another challenge. So this is stuff, yeah, same old stuff here. Interception, really struggling with working on a joint objective for steelhead with DFO. Balancing preferences among the anglers. I get a lot of letters from different interest groups every year. And of course, the appropriateness of hatchery use in the management of steelhead continues to be debated hotly, not necessarily within our own program, but among various interest groups. So we don't need to get into that. Here's what I've been working on. The direction from headquarters is, rather than put together a real detailed, long-winded 200-page plus management plan for steelhead in BC, what we're going to attempt to do is to put together a fairly concise, overarching document, I hope, that really lays out some key almost policy-type pieces in there in terms of how we in general are going to manage steelhead in BC. So it's going to provide that provincial direction, but really it's going to guide our regional staff on the actual implementation. We don't have to, it's not one size fits all, we don't have to do the same thing among regions, as long as they're following those general ideas that we can all agree upon. And that's really what we'll be looking for feedback from you guys, just our general strategies, how to address the various issues. Well, first of all, you agree with the various issues we identify in here, you agree with the objectives, does that seem reasonable? That's a lot of writing, but this is, some of the guiding principles we've been trying to work on. Conservation is the top priority, and I think you guys can agree with that. We really are interested in minimizing fisheries-related mortality, as we believe it maximizes adult escapement and opportunities for angling. And so there's a number of pieces here. I don't know if we really want to get into that. The other thing we really hope to capture in this document is those broad strategies. And what I see here with these broad strategies is we'll have just a sort of an overarching description on, they're almost, again, policy type things, catch and release, that kind of thing. And then we're hoping that there'll be separate action pieces that can feed into that will get developed over time as everybody identifies the priorities associated with these different strategies. So we're hoping that's fairly inclusive of the issues and concerns related to steelhead management. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything that really jumps out there for anybody. No.
Okay, talking about the province-wide regulatory
Yes.
and overarching, will there be sort of an overseer or steelhead czar, for lack of a better term, or somebody, rather than have basically what we have now, where we've got these little kingdoms around the province? And will there just be like a piece of paper that says this is what you're all supposed to follow? Or is there going to be some...
That's what this is at a high level. Okay, so what we're trying to sort out right now are things like catch and release, rationale, bait. That's a heavily debated issue. So the intent is that once we've got those sort of high level pieces, as long as you're being consistent with that, maybe you have a different way of managing to meet that objective, as long as does that make sense?
Well, yeah.
I know, and it really depends on, what is that overarching piece?
It's kind of frustrating where we've grown up with whoever's in charge of this region makes up his little rule, and there is or there isn't bait, or there is or there isn't whatever, and in this area there's something totally different.
And I absolutely agree, and that, I'm hoping that we can start to get at that issue with this document. So we're hoping it gets down to a level that, you know, like, what are the key issues you're concerned with? Are they in here? Are they addressed at this level? And that's where we'll be looking for some feedback here.
There's a couple other challenges you haven't mentioned.
Oh, okay.
And one of them is sort of related to what Tyler raised.
Yeah.
And in my view, on-the-ground steelhead management isn't really being done by the ministry.
Yeah.
It's being done by a whole variety of different groups like Pacific Salmon Foundation,
Yep.
BC Conservation
That's not
Foundation,
changing. I hate to say it.
Freshwater Fisheries Society, a zillion different federal hatcheries, the Steelhead Society.
Yeah.
God knows who else is
Yeah.
actually doing steelhead management. And the regional steelhead managers, in many cases, probably don't even really know what's going on in their region. And
So,
you know,
Yeah,
so that's a huge challenge.
it's
you know.
a challenge and it's a reality.
Yeah.
I don't see that changing. We are not going to increase capacity anytime soon. Is there a different way to do it, do you think?
I think there has to be.
No, but given with the existing capacity, which,
Yeah.
I mean, weekly I hear about retirements and they're not filling those positions.
I know. I'm just thinking about
Yeah.
particularly like, you know, the hatchery programs in the Lower Mainland. Nobody's got a clue as to what's actually going on in those programs.
I'm working on that right now. That one's a challenging one.
Like I ask questions and nobody can give me an answer on some of
Yeah.
these. And it's sort of like, you know, a problem arises in the hatchery as well, we gotta do this, you know, but they don't tell me that.
Yeah.
That sort of thing is going on all over the place.
My hope is with that particular one is that we can really tighten that up. And I mean, they are all now going to be required to have one of these licenses, right? And some of them are stuck with this federal car license. I don't know. It's a real nightmare right now, but I think it's going to help us move forward and tighten things up. But
So we need some overarching rules about a lot of things.
so
And
that's
the regulatory approach has to be more than just angling.
sorry, the
The
regulatory.
regulatory approach has to be more than just angling. We need a way to sort of keep everybody going down the same road.
So I really think you should think about that as we get this stuff out there, and does this go far enough? And it's not gonna address the, you know, river by river issues, but it's essential that we bring some consistency in here, right? I mean, some of these regulations have been around because, you know, 30 years ago they were developed and they just perpetuate them.
Yeah,
Right.
and they were developed in a different era where we,
Yeah.
you know, prior to catch and release in many cases.
Yeah.
The other challenge is we want to be informed by science, but we're really not doing it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's particularly important now, like we have new technology, we're
Yeah.
learning all sorts of new things about steelhead that
Yeah.
have to totally change the way we look at managing them. But
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know
Yeah.
if I would say we're not being informed by science. I mean, there are some
yeah,
minor.
there's nowhere
Limited.
near as much directed research as there used to be.
There's no money for science anymore.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, I mean, for us, HCTF has become the primary source of money,
Exactly.
which isn't, you know, it's given all the interests out there, it's not a lot of money. So, yeah, no, I absolutely don't, I agree with you. I'm not sure how to fix it.
You know, I think for groups like this, like, you can work with people like myself or Sue or Rob or whoever, right, within that level of government. But like where I think I need the help from groups like this is you need to be pounding on those ministers' doors, whoever they are, provincial, federal. We need service, right? You can tell Sue, we need more research, we need more whatever. You can tell me we need more restoration. That's great.
We now have lost all our research scientists. We don't have any.
The
They've all retired.
decisions are made in Victoria and Ottawa, and those guys are not hearing enough on a regular basis what you folks need.
Yeah.
right, which is more
I mean,
service-based.
maybe we should be funding research instead of
I think to
habitat improvement. I don't know.
part of where we can help
Yeah.
is getting that feedback from you, saying,
Yeah.
this is what you guys need to do. You need to
Yeah.
pound out these letters or
Yeah.
whatever, because we don't know, like, we're looking, you know, at these
Yeah.
corporate vandals.
You don't
in
necessarily have
Ottawa
to sign your
getting
name to that
angry,
letter, just.
You know, and we're trying to respond, but if we
And I-
actually have that
yeah,
inside track,
no, I-
saying, hey guys, focus this way, then we can do that, right? And that's-
Well, I mean, I think, well, there's a DFO person.
Hey, Sean, look at that!
You can't hurt his feelings.
I just put rocks in rivers. That's all I do.
Come on, let's be honest here. Get it up.
No, I mean, we have been banging our heads so long with the commercial fishing and interception issue. I think we are thinking a new approach is probably what's needed, and there is every intention to engage you guys. Once we get our head wrapped around it, because it's been a real frustration that our socioeconomic benefits derived from our steelhead fisheries have not been acknowledged in those OIF and complete. All they care about is conservation, which I absolutely agree with. But, you know, all they want to know from us is what's the bottom line, and no. There's more to it than that. We have a thriving industry, a thriving, you know, not to mention that we don't think that some of your non-selective, you know, it's not very progressive. What happened to your ecosystem approach that you touted so much in your wild salmon policy? It's so narrowly focused, and we really aren't implementing that stuff. And so we can only say that so many times, and try to work together. And we've come to realize that our definitions of conservation are quite different from what they're using in managing their commercial fisheries. I mean, we really believe conservation is wise use, and that's, you know, we're about opportunity, expectation, opportunity, and it's quite different. We are, I think, philosophically different from the objectives associated with commercial fisheries, and I don't know how to.
Maybe you gotta put it in language they can understand, that we have a commercial fishery for steelhead, and the numbers aren't there yet, so knock it off.
But then, and you know, they do that, and they say, well, how many do you want? Or what's the maximum mortality rate you're willing to accept? And when you don't know how many fish you have out there, it's very hard to come up with those numbers, because we just, you know, we can come up with estimates for the Skeena or for Thompson,
But having said all that, Sue,
yeah,
how come steelhead haven't been listed as a threatened species in the Thompson?
in the Thompson.
Is that, you, Sarah, list them, and then you're gonna see some changes.
Do you think so?
You won't be angling them.
Well, I don't know. I mean, and this is the issue, right? Because there's been some debate of how effective is that? How effective is listing it?
Well, I know for Coho, they got threatened,
Yeah,
and the amount of money that we've had access to in the last 10 years has been phenomenal, right?
yeah,
And now we're seeing a blip.
yeah.
And maybe it's just a couple of years, maybe it's not, but the resources that go with those labels definitely go up, right?
Yeah, I agree, because if they were to be assessed into Kosiwak, I sat on Kosiwak for 6 years, they would definitely at least reach
Like,
that.
how big do those red circles need to be before they're threatened?
Pardon?
How big do those red circles
Yeah.
need to be before it's considered a threatened species?
Yeah, no, I hear you, but there are some concerns about going that route as well.
There's two things come out of that.
And-
Economics of farming is never ever gonna let them go on the endangered species list or threatened species up
Well,
there
this is the
anyway.
thing, right?
The other thing is the science, because they're saying that the genes of the ones that go to sea are the same as the rainbows that stay in the river. So if that's the case, and the old thinking is that in a sterile stream and mountain stream, the fish go to sea to survive. They come back, some do residualize. The ones that residualize at cases will protect the species from full implosion, because eventually they'll decide to go to sea too. So if that science is already there, how are you going to get them on the endangered species list or threatened list if both share the same genes?
I agree, and you know, that was always my I was trying to figure out why the Americans were really interested in that, because I thought, oh, they're just trying to get these things off the list down there in the States. And then I look at some of their documentation, and they basically said, well, in the populations we're looking at, there isn't any mixing between the two populations. They are quite distinct still. So they somehow skirted around it. But I don't know. I don't know how that would, I think that's part of the challenge. I mean, what are we dealing with? I still would be very concerned, because I still am very concerned, because you know, if you just keep a population in that particular life history state for several generations, like how long does it take before it loses that ability to go to sea? You know, and eventually they will fully residualize. I don't know. We don't know these questions.
Look at kokanee. 100 years later.
Yeah, but then they surprise you. So,
Would it be possible to say that something in the Thompson, as we increase habitat, which has been a big focus for 10, 15 years, you also increase residualization?
so if it,
The fish that stay.
yeah.
If you're increasing habitat,
Yeah.
restoring habitat,
You might, I guess you might see, if you're seeing more, yeah, you might be providing more habitat for those resident type life
that's a
histories.
safer bet.
It's more likely to be a pink salmon issue.
Yeah.
I mean, when it comes to the habitat for myself, I mean, I've always looked at it as, if you don't have a good living room for them, you're doomed, and that's just reality. You know, look at the Upper Squamish, they got no more living rooms, never coming back.
It'll be interesting to see
You
how
gotta have the
for
habitat.
the Thompson, this joint project between the First Nations groups up there, so they are, with Dave Levy, they are looking at what the most significant limiting factors are. I mean, you know, and how much is fresh water and how much is flow an issue for those steelhead populations.
So when talking about limiting factors, here's a great question, there's a room full of anglers. In your experience, travels, meetings with the states and everything, is there actually a place where you could use angling as a limiting factor for steelhead at all, anywhere?
Never run into it.
Currently,
Does an example exist?
The Great Lakes.
Those don't count.
you mean steelhead, for steelhead?
For steelhead, yes. It's okay to say no. Everybody does.
Well, I mean, to toe the line, I have to say no, or that's generally the sense that
That's all you need to hear.
but it is an assumption, we are assuming that
To say we have no impact is ignorant,
Yeah.
but there will be an impact, but.
Yeah, we believe more or less, I mean, with exceptions associated, you know, where we are concerned, for example, with bait, that mortality rates associated with certain types of fishing might be higher, and populations can't sustain that for any length of time, right? Particularly if they're in a declined state, it doesn't help. But for the most part, we want to believe that catch and release is just, you know, it doesn't produce a
To
significant.
me, when you have an example of lower, 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 we have an increase. The whole while angling's happening. If you have this increase and you're gonna blame angling, how is it possible you had an increase in population while those progenies, parents were caught and released and impacted? There'd be none left in the better if it was truly a huge factor, because
No, I mean,
look at the numbers.
yeah, I mean, it bounces all, those estimates do bounce around, but we generally believe they're 5% or less.
Sue, like sort of, did this whole discussion around resident rainbows versus steelhead and the fact, I mean, I personally believe that they're very much integrated with each other. And essentially by us, you know, bitching about the fact that some of them, not as many of them might be becoming anadromous because of certain factors, maybe there's more food or river flows are lower, it doesn't force many of them out, kind of makes steelhead look like, us wanting more steelhead to come back because that's the preferred angling choice because they're larger and they're more pretty, makes them look like our play toys in a sense. I'm not trying to, I like catching steelhead more than rainbows obviously, but at the same time, I mean, there's still a ton of races of steelhead. Regardless of this fact, if somehow they stuff that in your face, there's still a lot of races of steelhead and or rainbows that are we don't know enough about. We haven't studied them. They're, you know, like think of all the creeks in Fraser Canyon. They probably have steelhead races that have been hit or hurt. We don't know anything about.
We don't know what we've lost already.
So,
you know, just I would be careful in saying that, you know, just because we've lost that life history strategy or its decline, I would be really concerned because we want to maintain that diversity. You know, we want to see it there so that it can persist as a species. I mean, I think it, you know, those strategies are there for a reason, and if we lose one over time, you know, that ability to do that, they're gonna lose that ability, because it just, they don't need it, so it just, it'll get bred out of them, you know?
One of my overarching concerns with all of this is who ultimately has the ultimate say when, you know, all these identified issues come to head. Basically what I'm getting at, okay, so we've got all these IPPs popping up absolutely everywhere. We know there's very low compliance rates. We know the issues, so on and so forth. You know, I've participated in meetings where we've got COs right here, we've got, you know, before they were let go, we've got the biologists here saying, yeah, this project is killing X number of fish because of ramping issues. The COs have been told from somewhere, do not pursue charges. And as Joe Blow guy that's listening to this, I'm turning purple, trying to restrain myself, going, what's going on here? You know, when you've got a federal government saying, you know, ignoring a $26 million inquiry, and then just saying, here, the doors are open. At some point, we have, whether as individuals or as a ministry or whatever, people in British Columbia have to be able to stand up and say, no, we are protecting this.
Yeah.
Right? And for someone like me, it's like, okay, do we just continue on writing letters? Or at what point does, you know, who has ultimate say where we say, no, this isn't going to happen? Right? Like that's, for me, that's so frustrating. Like,
yeah, I hear you. I suffer the same frustration. You see this stuff going in. I see this stuff going on in my ministry. What do you?
I mean, at what level, like, you know, you go like, okay, somebody somewhere along it's coming down from the top that's tying everybody's hands behind their backs. You know, what tools, you know, does the average public have?
I always hear letter writing, and I don't know how effective that is. I mean, the higher up you got somebody, you know, the more organized you are in those submissions. I don't know, because you know who answers those letters, it's me.
Yeah.
You know, I write a letter to the minister and they sign it. It goes through all these filters to make sure it's been washed and clean and sounds good and says nothing, but there you go. Sorry, I'll just be blunt there.
And on that note, we can break for lunch.
Oh, you weren't filming that, were you?
Red light's on.